everyone. We're really excited for tonight's event. My name is Francis Shen. I'm the director of the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. In a second, I'm going to hand it over to our Dana Career Network Senior Fellow, Emily Rodriguez. I just want to let everyone know, and I'll put this link into the chat as well, that you can find more about the Dana Foundation Career Network, our Neuroscience and Society, including our new NeuroX 101 series, which this event is kicking off, and all kinds of other things at our website, neuroxcareers.org. You can subscribe to the newsletter and learn more about events and the career fair and all sorts of additional stuff. So lots of exciting things there. And really excited for tonight's program. As I mentioned, it's Brain Awareness Week, and we are excited to kick off a NeuroX 101 series. The idea is that with each of these NeuroX 101 events, kind of give an introduction to a field that you may not know anything about or maybe didn't hear about until tonight. And we've brought leading experts in, and we're really grateful for their time and sharing their wisdom with us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emily. Thank you, Emily, for running the show.
No problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Rodriguez. I'm Senior Fellow with the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. Happy Brain Awareness Week. This is our first NeuroX 101 event, as Dr. Shen referred to. So this will be the first in a series of talks and panels that we'll host that feature an introduction to some NeuroX field, or like an interdisciplinary academic space between neuroscience and like anthropology, policy, ethics, and more. So this week, we're looking at neuroarchitecture, or the intersection between architecture and neuroscience. We have two wonderful speakers. The first who will speak is Margaret Tarampi. Margaret Tarampi, PhD, is the Director of University Interdisciplinary Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Hartford. Her Spatial Cognition and Physical Environments, or SCAPE laboratory, investigates the cognitive mechanisms that underlie space perception and spatial cognition in select populations, including the visually impaired and spatial experts such as dancers and architects. She also studies spatial thinking, perception and action, perspective taking, crowd dynamics, joint action, and kinesthetic energy. Our second speaker is Meredith Benasiak, research for BA Science, the research and innovation group of the design firm Boulder Associates. There, she conducts real-world research with clients and design teams to support data-driven, science-informed design for improving health, experience, access, and performance in built environments. So they'll both present. They'll give us an introduction to neuroarchitecture as a field. If you have any questions over the course of both of these presentations, feel free to put them in chat, and we'll have some time afterwards to address all of your questions. So to start, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks to Francis and the Dana Foundation Career Network for Neuroscience and Society. It's just such a pleasure to have a space with others who are working at the intersection of neuroscience and other fields. It's such a wonderful, I think, intersection, because there's so many interesting questions that can be investigated or understood through this relationship. So I'm just going to, let me share my slides here and just talk a little bit about the history of neuroarchitecture as a field, and essentially where we're at and where we're going. And it's going to be very basic because I just for the sake of time, but we can get into it further if folks have questions, and feel free to put those questions in the chat. If you were at the career fair before when I spoke, I gave a little bit of background about this, and I think it's important to include it here for those who weren't there, and I'll just keep it abbreviated. But neuroarchitecture really started with Jonas Salk and his beautiful Salk Institute, which for architects is really a mecca. And it was Salk that told us this story, or told architects this story in the early, I think, 2000s, about when he was working on the polio vaccine, and that he was mentally stuck. And so when he was working in his lab at UPitt, and so he took a sabbatical to the Abbey in Assisi. And he said there was something about the space there, the environment there, the architecture there that allowed him to think beyond what he could when he was, in Pittsburgh. And it was there that he figured out how to develop what would become the polio vaccine. He went back to his lab in Pittsburgh and he tested it and it worked. And he basically challenged architects to say, you should study this. This is a very rich area of study that we don't know much about. How does the environment, how does architecture affect humans? So while that was going on, I just want to say that, back early days of architecture, real early days, right? Vitruvius is one of our earliest thinkers. He said that architects should be equipped with the knowledge of many branches of study and very kinds of learning, for it's in his judgment that all work done by the arts is put to the test. The knowledge is the child of practice and theory. And so the idea of trying to integrate other fields into architecture was always at the core of architecture as a practice and as a discipline. At the same time as Jonas Salk was encouraging architects to understand how the environment is affecting humans, I remember as a child hearing these kinds of myths about the brain, that we only have so many brain cells. And so you want to be careful. You don't want to lose any brain cells from doing anything bad, like drinking alcohol or something like that, right? Because it's limited. And of course, we know that's not necessarily true. There was this finding about neuroplasticity in this particular area of the brain that's pretty relevant to architecture, which is the hippocampus. And so neurogenesis means that there is still in the adult brain the birth of new neurons. And the hippocampus is important, particularly in many things, but in terms of architecture, in terms of space, in terms of navigation. And the idea that we still have some sort of new birth of cells in the hippocampus as an adult was really just like a fascinating idea for architects. And then on top of that, we have these findings from Rusty Gage at the Salk Institute, who saw that what he termed enriched environments increase this neuroplasticity. And so we have, on the screen here, what you're seeing is in A, what we typically in animal studies, we usually hold our lab subjects in these kinds of bare spaces. And in the idea that we might have these environments that are more enriched. So you have more rats living together. You have tubes and tunnels and wheels and all sorts of different things, right? And C and this other image on your, I think, right, that are engaging different parts of the brain. The idea that enriched environments, however you might define that, can increase neuroplasticity. Architects were just the community were really excited about this idea. And so when we think about early behaviorists like Skinner said, and certainly all the behaviorists are really interested in the idea about how does environment affect the organism, right? It's clear we must take into account what the environment does to an organism, not only before, but after it responds. Behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. It's true that the man's genetic endowment can be changed only very slowly, but changes in the environment of the individual have quick and dramatic effects. And I know that Meredith will talk more about this, but I think it's ideas like these that also can help inform on the science side. So what we have here is both scientists telling architects that maybe we should better understand how our environments are influencing humans, their behavior, their health, their well-being. And then at the same time, we also are trying to influence scientists to think, hey, I know all this time we really haven't been using the environment as a variable, right? We've been like having these very controlled experiments, and now maybe it's time to factor that back in, because the environment probably has a huge impact on multiple levels that we might be interested in both neuroscience and in architecture. Okay, so just a little bit of a framework to think about. Something that I think is really unique to neuroarchitecture that I realized at the last career fair is that in many, I think in some of the other NeuroX fields, it's not necessarily bidirectional. I think in neuroarchitecture, we're really struggling as a field, because both we're looking to have how to have neuroscience affect architecture, like what is actually created by architects. And we're also interested in understanding architecture better by understanding neuroscience. And the fact that we want both, rather than, say, using architecture as a variable in neuroscience research, for example, the fact that we're trying to use neuroscience to change the way we practice architecture creates this really interesting and rich ground, but also creates a lot of tension. And that's currently, I think, our state of affairs. And I don't think that's bad, but I think we're still working through what that means. And when we think about the different parts of the questions that can be asked or that are being asked currently within this realm, we probably think about three things: the architect, the users, and the building itself. And then, of course, all the interactions that are involved between those things. And a lot of our work in, well, a lot of the work in architecture, for example, has been focused on the building itself. There's so much research and so much advancement that has happened in terms of what we can build because of physics and structures and advancements and all sorts of different types of technologies. That part of it has really flourished in terms of that work. And now I think we're coming back to trying to understand more the understanding the user within this relationship. And so just as we see in the neuroarts, the focus on understanding the brain in order to promote health and well-being is also a big part of this field. Understanding behavior, understanding cognition, all of those things as it's affected by, or as it's influenced by the building, or as it's influenced by the architect or those who are designing these spaces. And in these little other spaces, I think this is kind of focused on things that I do, but there currently work in these spaces at the moment at the intersection of users and buildings, and architects and the buildings, and architects and the users. And I think as we understand and explore more how neuroscience can help inform these different relationships, and how architecture can help inform the science in terms of what to focus on in the environment, what might be the most important aspects or variables that we may want to include in our studies. I think we have room for that for all of these things to be influenced by the neuroarchitecture. Okay, so I'm just going to go real brief on this because my point of view is that there's a lot of things that architects do really well from centuries of practice. And so that tacit knowledge is an area that we can study with science to say, we've been doing these things, why do they work well? And then the other side is, can we develop tools for architects so they can design buildings better or design spaces better that will coincide with the needs of humans and what will be spaces that will allow them to thrive. And just one example I want to give is about learning environments, and in particular, this beautiful kindergarten, the Fuji Kindergarten by Tezuka Architects, and how, if we remember about the enriched environments for rats, these ideas of having lots of people, so there's a social aspect, there's the all different tubes and wheels, so there's that movement aspect, there's these other sensory pieces, visual things, tactile things. So all of these things, I think, are evident in this particular building. I'm not going to spend much time on the details of the building, but I just want to go through the slides so you can get a sense of how architects have intuition. I think this is the tacit knowledge they have. It's just, can we then use this as a way to study if it is in fact having an impact in terms of the brain, right? So here, this is, I think, a very different way to think about schools, right? So we have these open spaces. We have these ways for kids to look down into other classrooms at other children who are in class, right? The idea that of having that social connection is more important than ideas of distraction, for example. We have all sorts of different ways of movement. So you have the stairs going up and you have a slide going down. You have all sorts of fun, tree houses in these spaces. And you can see there's a child climbing the tree itself. They created these nets, so obviously for safety, but also it becomes a place of dialogue for children and for play. They have different ways to reuse. So these are chairs, but they can also be a train. It could also be a wall, right? And so we can see the roof is a circle, so the kids can run around it. And then you have all these different levels, so they can walk underneath the stairs. And so I think we can see how architects intuitively might be able to tap into these ideas of what may potentially be an enriched environment for humans. And so I think there's the desire on one end to understand, is that actually beneficial to student learning, for example, to emotional intelligence, all of those kinds of things. On the other hand, we might think about, how can we develop tools for architects? And so just really briefly, in some of my work on low vision, so here's just this is, I think, Caesars in Las Vegas. And here is in a normal vision conditions, here's under low vision conditions. How can we understand how people who have low vision navigate spaces? And can we then design the environment in ways that will make their navigation safer? This also benefits pretty much everyone in terms of anyone who might have some sort of movement disability, for example, or any sort of other issues in terms of vision or sight. So we can keep this low vision information in mind. If you don't know, low vision can be any combination of acuity, contrast, field of view restrictions, sometimes a mixture of those. On the left is normal vision, and then on the right are different simulations of different eye diseases. So low vision can manifest in many different ways. It is very varied in terms of how it manifests. And so that makes it difficult for architects, for policies to be made in order to ensure that people can navigate safely. And I'll just run through this. Essentially, the idea is, can we understand the way that people understand space in terms of their perception, in terms of their cognition, and use that as a way to redesign or to design spaces that is going to be safer for them. And so we did a lot of experiments. I worked with an interdisciplinary team, and we did maybe 50 studies to understand space perception and spatial cognition in low vision individuals, and then use that to inform a neural network model that then could be predictive of how someone, pretty much anyone with any variety of low vision deficit, might perceive space and what might be problematic. So we looked at hazard detection, avoidance. We looked at being able to figure out where you are in space. We looked at mobility, navigation, how they got around. And there's a lot of complexities. I won't get into it, but because it turns out that it's the influence of both materials, geometry, and lighting that creates problematic geometric configurations for those with low vision, it's not possible to have just simple guidelines. And that's why we went towards creating some sort of tool that could simulate what it might be like for someone with low vision navigating space. And maybe, yes. So here's just a model of a space. We put some sort of simulation. We can decide what level of low vision simulation we want. It will read what the edges are. So what are the geometry of that space? It will look at the way that the lighting is influencing the things or the objects within the space as well. And then it will essentially say, hey, it'll look over 365 days of year within that particular area and say, these things in red are problematic for someone with low vision problems. It doesn't say why. It just puts it back in the designer's hands and says, hey, these might be problematic at some point for someone with low vision. You might want to think about how to reconfigure it, and then they can run the simulation again. Yes, and I'm probably stop there because I probably have used too much time, but I just want to say that I think there's so many ways that we might pursue neuroscience and architecture, and certainly those are just to either end, I think, of the scale, and there's so much in between. And I can't wait for Meredith to talk about how architects are really trying to now implement it into practice. So I'll leave it to Meredith.
Oh, thank you. I also want to extend so much gratitude to you, Dr. Shen and Emily, for putting together these NeuroX resources and community and networking opportunities. I'm going to talk about Neuroarchitecture 101 in practice. I work as Director of Research for Boulder Associates. We're a design firm that specializes in healthcare. We're a little more than 200 people with offices around the Western United States. And I'm coming to you today from outside Denver. At Boulder Associates, I work on a team called BA Science, and we're charged with being the innovation engine of the firm. So I get to do a lot of like research and development projects and work with forward-thinking clients. So it's really a dream job for me to be working in that space. And by practice, I just mean kind of how this applies to the actual kind of an architecture firm or design firm as we're designing buildings and built environments. So Margaret and I both started as pioneers with the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture 20 years ago. So we've been at this a long time. And our title that we were given at that time was actually pioneer because we were pioneering this new discipline. And so essentially we were preparing for a career that didn't yet exist. So there was no educational path. There wasn't any path really. So for me personally, I just followed what was interesting to me, which was, always about understanding kind of person-place interactions. My undergrad education was pre-med and classical archaeology. And what I came to realize after getting my professional degree, my graduate degree in architecture, is that architecture is really just doing archaeology in a reverse order. If you think about it, archaeologists study physical artifacts and building ruins to get information about the people that made them, about their cultures, about their behaviors. And architects study people and behaviors and cultures to design the right artifacts and buildings, right? So same equation, just kind of solving for different variables, but it's something that I carry into kind of the way I design and study built environments. So I want to share just 3 points with you about neuroarchitecture in practice, trying to address why, what, and how. Beginning with why is neuroarchitecture important to practice? This is obviously a big one because until we get the value proposition right, we're not going to see any change. There's no kind of momentum to overcome kind of our current way of designing and delivering built environments. Um, for me, the value proposition is that our buildings are killing us. So this is very much the same thing Margaret was saying, but just I'm more of a glass half empty kind of person. So where she's talking about how enriched environments can enhance our brains and performance. I guess the glass half empty version is that actually our environments are also killing us and harming us. And I think people kind of started to understand this during COVID, but generally regarded COVID as sort of a temporary passing thing where there was a drive to get back to normal or the old way of doing things, right? So we didn't quite get to that tipping point. We started to, but not quite. And we even see this with our clients. Like they made very sort of temporary changes to the environments that they could easily tear away and go back to normal once we got past COVID. Until now, I think that harm has been more or less invisible, and so designers can kind of plead ignorance. But the evidence from neuroscience, from the health sciences, that's coming out is pretty overwhelming, and so there's a greater responsibility for us as designers to do no harm. This is just one very powerful example of a prison, and certainly there's lots of other types of buildings, but there's a significant body of neuroscience research that's shown that long-term solitary confinement causes not only psychological harm, but also structural and functional neurological damage. And essentially, that's because the solitary confinement cell is a deprived environment, where a deprived environment is defined as missing those enriched environment features that Margaret shared with you. So there's no novelty, there's actually monotony, there's no ability to explore. The confined space doesn't allow for motor activity or exercise. Of course, there's social isolation and then sensory deprivation. And all of that, has major health consequences and brain change that are so serious that human rights organizations like the United Nations, and even our own professional organization, the American Institute of Architects, have outlawed designing for solitary confinement in prisons in our code of ethics. Unfortunately, we have lots of other deprived environments, right? Daycares, nursing homes, long-term rehab, economically and play-deprived neighborhoods. All of those deprived environments are also causing harm to our occupants. And so that's kind of, for me, the value proposition to do something different. So what needs to change? What can our profession do about it? We need to, as Margaret suggested, include the person when we think about how we're designing built environments. This isn't neuroscience. For this audience, it's just common sense. but it's not common practice in design. In design, we tend to design environments as empty vessels, and there inevitably kind of results in a mismatch once it becomes occupied. Then we have to figure out how to adapt, and we usually change the person. And so what you see here is not some cool way to measure brain activity. It's actually a helmet called the isolator that was developed in 1925 to eliminate noise so the person could do more focus work, right? And it was so good at sort of um, screening out all the elements that it also kind of eliminated oxygen, which is why you see that supplementary tank there. Um, but we do this all the time, right? We change the person instead of the environment. I drink coffee in the morning and to wake up, to be alert, instead of getting enough, blue high intensity daylight. Maybe I drink alcohol. I do drink alcohol to relax instead of taking a walk in nature. We all wear masks to filter the air that we breathe instead of having better ventilation systems in our buildings or opening windows. Um, so basically what needs to change is how do we set up that alignment from the beginning by understanding the built environment as an ecosystem and then designing the ecosystem so that it can achieve homeostasis. So that's understanding the individual differences of people, like people with low vision, like Margaret shared, as well as processes. So, what neural processes are we going to engage in a certain space? Are we going to support? Is it learning? Is it wayfinding? Is it arousal for another person, right? Architecture can even we can design for lust. We can. So aligning space design with process and people. We do that in co-creation events where we're bringing in patient volunteers and staff because we value their experience, and we use that as evidence. So we also do this in kind of we can do this in virtual environments. Notice this isn't just a CAD floor plan drawing. There's actually people and they're doing things, and it tells us that this ecosystem isn't working. There's a very long line building up here. So, what needs to happen? Can we add more dressing rooms? Can we add another staff? Can we change the order that things happen? So again, we kind of are trying to tune that system and bring it into homeostasis. Okay. So if we accept kind of that people are part of the ecosystem and we're designing for that ecosystem, how are we doing neuroarchitecture in practice? And Margaret alluded to this, that we make use of evidence coming out of neuroscience labs at all scales, from neurons to systems, from both animal models and human studies. But the kind of so we make use of that knowledge and we try to translate it and apply it in how we design our environments. But we also want to sort of do our own sort of studies, and so that's where kind of real world or practice based research in real world settings falls at the end of that spectrum there. And the big difference is that these are not controlled settings. In an experimental design, right, you only want to change one variable at a time. And when we're designing and doing research in practice, there's lots of different variables that are changing within the system. So we tend to kind of look at big data, look for patterns in big data. We're lucky that we work with clients that have a portfolio of assets, so we can collect data on lots of different clinics and then look for outliers, that sort of thing. So in addition to just being in the literature, understanding how we can, interpret the stuff coming out of neuroscience, apply it to our designs, we also look for, I won't say it's neuroscience tools and instruments, but they're they're surrogates for nervous system activity, right? They're biometric sensors and wearables. Because they're, developed for consumers, they're accessible, they're inexpensive. Designers can pick them up the same way that sort of having access to our kind of health measures changes our health behaviors. Having access to kind of measures of humidity and CO2 and light meter. I have my light meter on today. You can't see it. That awareness helps us then when we start thinking about how to design for that. So it's kind of trying to democratize some of the tools and help raise designer awareness. Um, we can also kind of be measuring and monitoring some of these atmospheric um, features like humidity, carbon dioxide, and light, which we know are correlated with brain response as well. And we can do that within a space, or we can even do it at the person. So we can be tracking what my humidity levels are on me versus just what they are in the space, and really understand those interactions. So I think this notion of continuously monitoring our people in the environment, our environmental uh, atmospheric conditions, um, um, helps us continuously improve and again bring that system into homeostasis. So we're working toward kind of that digital twin sort of model that Margaret, the picture she showed at the end, we're kind of working on that. The fact that our environments change and aren't static allows them, this kind of digital twin model thing helps us be able to change things within the environment as well. So it's not always static. So my interest in I guess my goal in neuroarchitecture in practice is to help democratize these tools, this knowledge. I also do a YouTube micro learning series called Science and Design. They're just 3-minute segments that touch on some of the things that I mentioned today. But I'll just kind of end on this quote, which comes from both Margaret and my mentor, John Eberhardt, who was the founder of neuroarchitecture, who said, research is not just for the sake of research. Research is to figure out how to make ideas possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret and Meredith. That was super interesting. It seems like there's so much crosstalk between neuroscience and architecture on the individual level, like with respect to individual sensory experiences in built environments, and kind of in this affective sphere, like how do we change the things that are currently harmful? We have many very interesting questions. We have a hard stop at 7 p.m. Eastern, so apologies in advance if we can't get to it, but I'll just read off some of the questions that we have currently in the comments, and then both of you respond as you see fit or appropriate. Is that all right? Cool. So Sarah is asking, can you please recommend a book or film exploring enriched environments characteristics and how they impact cognition?
I put some links to scientific papers about enriched environments in the chat in reply. I also did a link for a recent film that was put together about neuroscience and architecture. And I think Meredith probably has another link for another film that she was in about neuroscience and architecture that she could probably add as well.
Okay. Great, cool.
And there's certainly also other popular books by like Sarah Williams Goldhagen and Sarah Robinson and Susan, can't remember. I can send these to Emily, and if folks are interested, I have a list of their books that might be of interest, but it's not necessarily exactly about enriched environments. I'll just put that out there.
Can I just add one thing? We're starting to see the emergence of enriched environment studies with people, specifically around people who have some sort of maybe they're in neuro rehab, or dementia or decline. There's a great study that was done on a sensory garden, which in and itself sounds like a beautiful space, right? But they compared that with what they called an enriched garden that really activated some of those cognitive mechanisms as enriched environments do. And then they reported out some results. So I can share that link as well. But it's cool to see that crossover happening in human research.
Thanks. And we definitely will distribute those resources for your reference later. Jack asks, for both panelists, have your studies led you to make modifications to your workspaces for improving your work lives?
Definitely. I think something that has been like I cannot stop thinking about it is kind of in the social justice literature from this artist collective, and unfortunately I can't think of their name at the moment. They pose this question about when did we decide that the best way to learn was sitting? And that just has like, I cannot stop thinking about it because it just calls to question all of our assumptions about the ways that we create space, that the ways that we create learning spaces, certainly, but like all of these earlier, Meredith and I were talking about healthcare spaces. Just, I think we make a lot of assumptions that we haven't questioned why we made that assumption to begin with. And now we're just continuing to try to see like, how can we make this better without saying, oh, maybe sitting isn't appropriate. Maybe it's not appropriate developmentally for kids. Maybe that is one of the reasons why, or maybe. And so I think when I think about questions about my workspace, I realize that I am now more aware that I have to integrate all of these things into my workday. So I have a lot of walking meetings. I try to just get outside, try to have views of nature, socialize. Like if I can ask a question from someone in person, even if, you know, I could be a quick email, I do that instead, because I think we felt through the pandemic that need for connection, that need for physical contact, for physical movement, all of those things. It really has changed the way I think about working, because sitting at a computer just doesn't seem right to me anymore. I don't know about Meredith, but
Yeah, I mean, so for me, okay, one of I think this is maybe true for many parents. Our greatest experiment is our children, and so um, I got into this because for me as a child, the too much stimuli would just really hijack my brain and put me into a place where I was emotionally just ungrounded and couldn't think. And unfortunately, whether nature or nurture, I passed that on to my son. And he's so sensitive to sensory stimuli. And so eating is hard when we have something that's really fragrant or disgusting looking. And so he builds, and I helped him, this sort of cereal box kind of fortress with a candle, and he picked out the scent in the middle. So he creates his own little micro environment that allows him to eat. So that's one of the ways I guess we've modified environments in response to behavior at home.
Oh, that's super interesting. Joshua asks, I'm a PhD student in experimental psychology. I became interested in neuroarchitecture as part of a study I'm working on, and I'm interested in learning more about the field and potentially going into consulting. What are next steps that you would recommend?
this is a great time. I think, as Meredith said, we've been at this for 20 years, and 20 years ago, there was really no path unless you were making it, and you were able to convince people to really integrate this into their architecture practice or into their labs. I think now there definitely is this ability to do consulting for architecture firms because now many firms are more aware and want to participate in research or integrate research into their practice. I think, Meredith maybe could speak better about this because I'm definitely more academic than I am out in practice. But my sense is I know several people who have gone that route. They're are trained as experimental psychologists or as neuroscientists, and then went into consulting in architecture firms. That there's many more venues to do that. And we could probably talk to you about different firms that have research arms that are hiring, like HKS or Perkins and Will or Perkins Eastman, I think are all have big research arms.
Yeah, I mean, my neuroscience training came from someone who is in neuroeducation. So I think, anyone who sort of has that cross-disciplinary systems thinking sort of training that they can share with you is really, really valuable. So that's I think, it doesn't have to be neuroarchitecture if that there might be other kind of places you can pick up the skills for in practice. I think, yeah, Margaret, you're right. I think we're getting somewhat more of a demand for that from our clients, but I don't know, like I've heard like there's like sort of a when it's a new concept, it's maybe like 3% of your projects will have sort of the early adopters who are willing to try something or be interested in something novel without it being tested. So, we're still it's still an invisible market or audience that we're trying to get this out to. So align yourself with, the more forward-thinking groups. Um, um, look for them. They'll be the ones who would be interested in your experience.
Cool. Thanks for that guidance. It looks like Stephanie's interested in this from like a research participant angle. It says, I'm a designer and was diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder at 40, and I'm acutely aware of how my environments affect my body. How do you find participants for studies, and how might a non-PhD professional become involved in this field of research and advocacy?
I'm just starting to get into this area of sensory processing disorder. One of my doctoral students, this is part of her work. But I think finding participants how do we find participants for studies? I have typically, I study like specialized, like select populations. So I'm usually trying to find particular populations like artists or architects and whatnot. And then so I usually recruit through their national organizations. I have been in talks with some other folks who are interested in neurodivergence and sensory processing disorder and things like that. And we're hoping that we'll be able to get some studies going, but I don't have any work currently in that realm. And so I think hopefully we'll have some sort of network or way to connect people. I hope that's part of what I really enjoying about this network is to kind of get those connections and be able to, if we are recruiting for particular populations, that we'll be able to share those calls with these groups.
Nice. Let's see, unless Meredith has something to add on this question. Let's see. Next question I'm seeing from Ellen. I am an architect and work at Swinburne University in a role that determines space planning requirements and investment in technology and equipment. Simulated environments and augmented reality are creeping into the learning space. How can we use neuroscience to guide digital lived space, augmented and physical space?
Such an interesting question. And one that I have been struggling with because the ways that technology has been developing, and I've taught and I've spoken with folks who are developing these kinds of rooms that essentially the idea is that they have cameras out to the outside world. So it's a room that's interior and it has virtual windows that if you were to look out of them, if there was a window there, it would show what you would typically show, or what you would see if there was a window. And the idea is, oh, well, we can create, are these types of spaces the same as the ones we actually make currently, as real existing windows, instead of virtual windows? The resolution is great. I think we have intuitions that it's different. And I think that work is just starting to happen now because it's just really expensive to get the technologies in order to do the research with these particular things. Like with virtual reality, before, when people were studying VR using head-mounted displays, I mean, that equipment was $10,000 or more. Now anyone can get them, right? You can get an Oculus, and so I think we're in that phase where trying to get these kind of AI or augmented reality spaces is very expensive. And so I think we really want to do the research. I think there's been some research that's related, especially in the healthcare realm, looking at, so there was this early finding by Roger Ulrich about looking out to trees resulted in less days in the hospital, less medications, less complaints by the patients. And then from that, they said, oh, okay, well, can it be a picture of nature? Does that do the same thing? Can it be a video? Can it be different types of art? And so that kind of work has been going on, which I think is somewhat related, but not exactly. But yeah, I think we're limited at the moment because of how difficult it is to do the research. But if you have access to these things, happy to talk about how we can work together, because that would be amazing.
Yeah, I think it's very important because it is going to become, well, it is already our reality, but there are studies, that show sort of the negative impacts of, Zoom fatigue, or where your brain is trying to occupy two spaces at once, even though one's virtual, it's still, I think there's some strain there. And so I think they're definitely, I'm not versed in this research, but I think it's a very important area of study.
Cool. Thank you. Jocelyn is asking, as a current undergraduate student interested in research, do you think it's necessary to have a graduate degree in architecture to be involved in this field? What is the ratio of neuroscience knowledge and architecture knowledge or background that someone interested in neuroarchitecture should have?
Okay, so one thing is, so I think in the 20 years since Margaret and I started, at the beginning there was neuroscience and architecture, and in the 2 decades since, there's been a lot of bridge professions emerge. One of the ones that I feel is really important, like if I was to make a hire tomorrow, I would be looking for a computational designer. A lot of computer science programs also require at least a minor in cognitive science so that you have that sort of human knowledge. But I feel like to sort of get architecture to using and developing some of the tools that Margaret and I shared today, we need more people skilled in computational design. So that would be one possible pursuit.
My advice usually to students is, what do you foresee yourself wanting to do with your career? Do you want to design the buildings, or do you want to do the research? And I think that then kind of dictates your path in terms of career. So if you want to do the research, then it probably makes more sense to pursue some sort of degree that will give you the skills to do, you know, experimentation or empirical work. If you want to build the buildings, then you need to get an architecture degree. That's just in terms of licensure, I think. So that's like, I think, a basic way of thinking about it, but I do think things are changing, as Meredith was saying, in terms of these bridge disciplines.
Well, thank you both. Somebody whose first name is MMY has asked, have you done research that demonstrates the evidential, financial, or fiscal benefits through the application of neuroarchitecture design principles? I guess it's maybe with relation to cost of constructed spaces, I guess.
No.
I mean, it's $1 million question. I think that's the other part of this that is difficult in terms of neuroscience and architecture, is that architects ultimately have so many other things that they have to consider in addition to the client, right? Is about the bottom line and getting it built and those kinds of things. I think we would hope that there will be ways to show financially how having these considerations over the long term have greater benefit to users. But I don't know if we're necessarily in those spaces yet. Maybe Meredith has a better idea.
Well, it's who's cost center and having the right people at the table to, because if you're just talking with facilities people, which is usually the people at the table, they're just looking for construction costs. And we know that, a building's life cycle is like 78% people costs and only 11% maintenance kind of costs. I'm talking life cycle costs here. So, but getting those advocates, those people at the table to talk costs, or even when you're talking back to harm and medical errors or falls, or getting those people at the table when you're about to embark on a new project is hard. So I guess it's whose cost, and then then you do have to do the study.
That makes sense. We only have a couple of minutes, so I think I'll ask one question just very briefly at the end here. And it's from Jack, who is a PhD student in computational neuroscience. Says, part of me always wanted to go into architecture. If you know what kinds of neuroarchitecture positions or internships might be a good fit for someone with my background, any tech roles?
It's a good question. Well, I think this relates to what Meredith was saying before. In terms of computational neuroscience, I think that is part of kind of some of the work that I do. But internships, I'm not sure about that aspect of it.
The London group from ANFA comes to mind. They were doing a lot of like agent-based modeling and predictive modeling around. The example they gave was the ED, but it could apply to train stations, that sort of thing. It wasn't Hugo's lab. I'm blanking. It was the other one.
Oh, I thought it was Hugo's lab.
No, it was the last day. Yeah, it was the last.
Christoph Hochschuler?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're at ETH in Switzerland.
In Switzerland.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a couple of folks. Yeah, definitely look. Christoph Hochschuler, I think, has an interesting group that is at ETH, and he also has a lab in Switzerland. And then Hugo Spear's lab in why can't I think, in the UK. I think either of those, they do a lot of work that probably aligns with your background. And then I'll just say to Meredith, there's another question in the chat that you should respond with your YouTube channel.
Thank you. Thank you for that plug. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I apologize to everyone who we didn't have time to get to their questions, but thank you again to you both. This has been incredibly interesting and enlightening about this field. And thank you for answering everyone's questions. And thank you everyone for attending. This is the first of our NeuroX 101 series. There will be more. So I think neuroscience and public policy is next Monday. So if you go to neuroxcareers.org/events, you'll see those as those continue to happen in the future. Yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.